Story 1. The Uninvited Passenger. It was a chilly October evening when Lisa and her two friends, Megan and Jake, set out on a road trip to visit a supposedly haunted town. This small, long-abandoned settlement called Ash Hollow was tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains, known for its dark history of unexplained disappearances. For years, the town had been a legend among paranormal enthusiasts. The trio, however, viewed it as nothing more than a fun, spooky adventure. As they drove further into the mountains, the fog thickened, reducing their visibility to only a few feet ahead. The winding road through the forest was eerily silent, save for the soft hum of the car engine. The radio lost signal miles ago, and their phones had no service. Megan, sitting in the back, joked about how this was the perfect setup for a horror movie, which prompted nervous laughter from the group. Lisa, the driver, forced a smile, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a figure darted across the road. Lisa slammed the brakes and the car screeched to a halt. Heart pounding, she looked at her friends, their faces pale with shock. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. He was sitting in the front seat, staring wide-eyed at the road ahead. "It looked like a person," Megan added, leaning forward. Lisa nodded, trying to calm her breath. "I'm not sure. It happened so fast." She glanced at her rearview mirror. Nothing but fog behind them. Deciding not to investigate further, Lisa restarted the car. The tension in the vehicle was palpable as they continued their journey, but then, as they were about to cross an old, rusted bridge, Megan gasped, "Lisa, stop the car!" Without hesitation, Lisa hit the brakes again. She turned to Megan, who was staring out of the window in horror. "There's someone standing in the road," Megan pointed, her voice shaking. Lisa and Jake turned their heads, and there, standing in the middle of the bridge, was the same figure. A pale, hunched man wearing tattered clothing, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't move, didn't seem to acknowledge the car. He just stood there, facing them. "What do we do?" Lisa whispered, her throat dry. "We have to go back," Jake urged. "There's no way I'm driving past that." As Lisa was about to shift into reverse, the figure took a step forward. And another. The closer he got, the more his features became visible. A gaunt face with hollow, sunken eyes and blood-streaked lips. His stare was vacant but unsettling, as though he wasn't really looking at them, but through them. Panic surged in Lisa's chest. She jammed the gear into reverse, but before she could move, there was a loud thump from the roof of the car. All three of them screamed, "Go! Go! Go!" Jake yelled. Lisa floored the gas pedal, speeding backward down the narrow mountain road. The figure in the distance was still moving toward them, slowly but steadily. Then another thump, harder this time. Someone was on the roof of their car. Heart racing, Lisa drove recklessly down the road until they reached a clearing. She slammed the brakes, causing whatever was on the roof to roll off with a heavy thud onto the ground. They sat in stunned silence for a moment, too terrified to move. Then cautiously, Jake opened the door and stepped outside to check. His blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest. Megan and Lisa jumped out of the car, rushing to see what had caused his terror. On the ground, next to the car, was the same pale figure that had been standing on the bridge. Except now, his body was twisted in unnatural ways, his limbs bent and broken, as if he had fallen from a great height. But the most horrifying part was the smile on his face, a grotesque, twisted grin, as though he had enjoyed every moment of their fear. The trio wasted no time getting back into the car, speeding away from Ash Hollow and vowing never to return. But no matter how far they drove, Lisa could still feel the presence of that uninvited passenger lingering in the back seat, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Story 2. The Static. Mark was a night owl, often staying up late watching TV to unwind after his long shifts. His old television set was outdated but reliable, and every night around midnight, he would flip through the channels, searching for something to help him fall asleep. One particular night, as Mark settled into his couch with a bowl of popcorn, he flipped through the channels absent-mindedly. He paused on a static-filled screen for a moment. It wasn't unusual for a few of the older channels to be fuzzy, but this time something was off. The static wasn't the usual black and white fuzz. It had strange shadows flickering through it, almost like shapes moving behind the screen. Intrigued, he leaned forward. Maybe it was just a bad signal, he thought, but as he continued to stare, the shapes began to form something more distinct. Figures, human-like, but blurry. They moved slowly, almost rhythmically, as if performing a strange, synchronized dance. A shiver crawled down Mark's spine, and he switched the channel, but no matter where he went, the static followed. He flipped rapidly through channels, trying to escape it, but every channel showed the same unsettling image, figures moving in the static, more clearly now, as though they were getting closer. Mark's heartbeat quickened. He fumbled for the remote, trying to turn the TV off, but it wouldn't respond. The power button on the set itself didn't work either. He yanked the plug out of the wall, but the TV stayed on. Now the figures on the screen had faces, gaunt, pale, and expressionless. They reached toward the screen as though trying to break through. Mark stumbled back, knocking over his popcorn in his panic. Suddenly, the sound of static filled the room. It grew louder and louder, a deafening roar that made Mark cover his ears. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The figures were gone. The screen was black. Everything was silent. Mark stood frozen in place, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After a few moments, he cautiously approached the TV, unplugging it once more for good measure. The room was eerily still. He laughed nervously to himself, trying to shake off the tension. But as he turned to leave the room, a cold gust of air swept through the room. He froze. Slowly, he looked back at the TV. It was off, but the screen was reflecting something. Someone. Standing behind him. Mark whipped around, but no one was there. Yet when he looked back at the TV, the reflection remained, a figure standing inches behind him, its face twisted in a grin, and it was getting closer. Story 3. The Whispering Field. Ellie and her brother Tom had grown up hearing stories about the field near their grandparents' old farm. It was said that if you stood in the center of the field at dusk, you could hear voices, soft whispers carried on the wind. Most people brushed it off as an old wives' tale, but as children, the siblings were both terrified and fascinated by the idea. One summer, when they were both in their 20s, they returned to the farm to help their grandparents with some repairs. As dusk approached one evening, after a day of hard work, they decided to test the old legend for themselves. The field was vast, surrounded by thick woods, with wildflowers dotting the landscape. It looked peaceful in the fading light, the air still and quiet. Ellie felt a strange unease wash over her as they reached the center of the field. It felt too quiet. "Do you hear anything?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie strained her ears. At first, there was nothing. But then faintly she heard it, a soft, distant murmur like many voices speaking at once. She turned to Tom, her heart racing. "I hear it," she whispered. The voices grew louder, though still unintelligible, as if they were speaking in a language she didn't understand. The wind began to pick up, swirling around them, carrying the whispers closer. "What are they saying?" Tom asked, stepping closer to her. "I don't know him, but I don't like this," Ellie replied, glancing around. The field no longer felt peaceful. It felt alive. Suddenly the voices stopped, replaced by a single clear whisper right behind Ellie's ear. "Run!" Without thinking, she grabbed Tom's arm and bolted for the edge of the field. They ran until they reached the safety of the farmhouse, both gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. Neither of them spoke of what happened that night, but from then on, Ellie knew one thing for sure. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed, and some whispers are warnings we should never ignore.